The man responsible for destroying many black liberation and equality movements in the U.S. was allegedly mixed race himself. In 1950, at 10 years old, Mildred Millie McGee says after a class discussion about J. Edgar Hoover, she hurried home to ask her grandfather if the notable FBI director was connected to the Hoover plantation in Mississippi, the one her relatives were enslaved on. He responded, "That old goat is my second cousin." Millie told her grandfather she would share the revelation with her friends, but he forbid her. Her grandfather said Hoover would have them murdered if his African ancestry was revealed. This was a deeply terrifying moment for young Millie that sparked nightmares for years.
My grandfather said, "Look, daughter, you cannot tell that. If you do, our whole family would be burned as we slept." It was the most frightening thing for 10 years old to hear.
As an adult, Millie's curiosity outgrew her fear, and she began intently researching to find the truth. Genealogist George Ott of Heritage Consulting in Salt Lake City, Utah, used census records, burial sites, and family documents from the black and white Hoover side to verify most of Millie's family's oral history. He also conducted the research for Alex Haley's roots, and reportedly said Millie's family's oral history matched even more closely than Haley's. Genealogist and historian Lucius Bowser and Julianne Burke assisted in the genealogical research. Oral history is vital in the African American community, considering records weren't kept of enslaved Africans since they were considered as mere property. There were usually no names listed on plantation owners' property records, no birth certificates or records of marriage since it was illegal for enslaved people to wed. It was important to pass down the history of their families orally, but for some families, the fear, violence, and shame of the past was so unbearable that they went silent, laying their family history permanently to rest. According to Millie's family's oral history, the story begins in Africa with a 15-year-old girl. She was kidnapped from her home and somehow survived the horrifying voyage to America just to be introduced to a different kind of horror: slavery. Felix Allen, a plantation owner, bought her, stripped the teenager of her African identity, and named her Sarah Allen. He would eventually rape Sarah, a practice slave owners called bedwarming. This resulted in the birth of a daughter, Elizabeth Allen. Felix would later rape his own daughter, and she also birthed a baby girl, naming her Emily. Forced incest and rape were commonplace during slavery. Felix Allen permitted another plantation owner, William Hoover, to sexually assault Elizabeth, impregnating her with a son that was named John T. Hoover. According to Millie's family's oral history, William Hoover decided to buy her and their son John T., but not Emily. Millie's family says it was because she was not his child. William Hoover's desire was to marry Elizabeth. Enslaved Africans were not only forbidden to marry one another, but those of European descent as well. So William moved them to the D.C. area where no one knew them. They married, and from that day forward, Elizabeth identified as a white woman. Many mixed-race people chose to identify as white only in a phenomenon called passing. They did so to escape the racial violence people of African ancestry faced in this country, allowing them to receive an education, considering it was illegal for enslaved people to even learn how to read. Passing allowed individuals to have a career, civil rights, to be treated as people and not property. During that time, America's one-drop rule stated, any person with even one ancestor of black ancestry was considered black. This was white supremacists' attempt to maintain a quote-unquote pure bloodline. This legal principle was a failure, considering hundreds of thousands of people with African ancestry passed for white. Elizabeth, however, did not have a choice. Since she was enslaved, she could not refuse William's proposal and was forced to live this new life. While Elizabeth lived in D.C. as the wife of her enslaver, her daughter Emily remained in Mississippi and was bought by a man named Christian Hoover Sr. He had two sons who were named William Hoover and Christian Kit Hoover. They sexually assaulted Emily at will resulting in the birth of several children. She would eventually have a son named Ivory, also referred to as Ivy, with Christian Kit Hoover. Ivy is the alleged father of John Edgar Hoover. The family in D.C. will often visit the family on the Mississippi plantation, and vice versa. When Dickerson came of age, he bought an enslaved woman named Annie on the Mississippi plantation. Millie says she was also mixed race and able to pass for white. According to the family story, Annie and Ivy were lovers as they lived on the plantation in Mississippi before Dickerson purchased her and took her to D.C. to marry. When Ivy would visit D.C. with his grandfather, Christian Hoover Sr., they would secretly meet, and during one of their rendezvous, Annie allegedly became pregnant with John Edgar Hoover. For clarity, Elizabeth Hoover, formerly Allen, had children by Felix Allen, her enslaver, and William Hoover, the man who bought and married her. She had Emily Allen by Felix, who gave birth to Ivory Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover's alleged father. She also gave birth to a son by William Hoover, John T., who had a son named Dickerson. Dickerson's mixed-race wife Annie had an affair with Ivy, her nephew of no blood relation, allegedly producing John Edgar.
My mother said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "Okay, I'm sitting down. What is it?" She said, "Ken just told me that Uncle Ivy, her grandfather, was J. Edgar Hoover's biological father."
So Millie claims Dickerson, the man who raised John Edgar, his wife Annie, and Ivy, Hoover's alleged biological father, were all mixed race, directly from the bloodline of an African woman. Millie says Hoover was allegedly unaware of his black ancestry until he was a teenager. Many families who passed chose not to tell their children because they were fearful they would accidentally reveal their secret. Christian Hoover Sr. willed Emily, Elizabeth's daughter, to his son William. Emily and all of her children began to live with William. William's wife would eventually divorce him and move to Texas. Millie and George would later discover census records listing Emily as his new wife.
Found Emily Allen, mother Elizabeth Allen. Emily Allen married, it says married in the census, to William Hoover and had all these babies and one named Ivy.
Emily had a heartbreaking life, with no opportunity to choose and make a life of her own, like many enslaved men and women. Although Dickerson despised J. Edgar, according to family legend, he raised him and continued his marriage to Annie after her affair. Dickerson was often away because sometime during the war, doctors sent him to an insane asylum at Laurel. After Hoover reached adulthood, Dickerson's mental illness worsened. He began suffering from anxiety, depression, and delusions, causing him to have a mental breakdown and forcing him to leave his government job. Millie's family's oral history states, Annie began living with Ivy in Mississippi. The research team was able to verify Annie living in the home with Ivy via census records. After Ivy passed, Millie's family says Annie returned home to D.C. Millie's family believes J. Edgar was responsible for Ivy's death. Through their extensive research, they were able to discover that J. Edgar Hoover was not Millie's grandfather's second cousin. He was in fact his first. Ivy was Millie's grandfather's father's brother. Although they had different last names, they were blood brothers. Christy Hoover Sullivan was also told their family was related to John Edgar. Christy says she discovered her great-grandfather, Dr. Clayton Hoover's name, within Millie's research. J. Edgar openly claimed Dr. Clayton's side of the Hoover family. Christy emailed Millie and shared the connection she made. She said the whole idea of our strand of Hoovers with history in Washington, D.C., having anything to do with slaves, was a difficult concept to swallow. But after reviewing the countless documents and traveling to the Mississippi graveyards and courthouses alongside Millie, she had no doubt Millie's family was related to John Edgar, just like hers. Christy was able to find birth certificates for all of her family members except for John Edgar, a dilemma Mildred and her research team also encountered.
We found documents that was erased, smeared, changed.
A couple of friends who did this routinely in Washington, D.C. They checked applicants. I talked to one of them one time, and he said, you know, just for the fun of it, I tried to find Hoover's birth record, and there's something wrong with it. And I said, oh? I said, yeah, I thought you'd be able to go all the way back to Europe with his record. No. And he was telling me about it. And he found some rather strange things, like there were some things that were erased, dates were changed, and the filings. And I thought, that's weird.
So when I talked to my mother and I asked her, does a man named J. Edgar Hoover ring a bell to you? And she was like, shh, shh, you can't tell that. You can't tell. There's two murders. And I'm trying to follow her. What has the two murders got to do with Big Daddy telling me this old goat was his second cousin? But Big Daddy also told me we could all be killed as we sleep. And I'm thinking, well, I didn't tell it. All these years, I didn't tell it. So why is two murders? Who was murdered?
It was J. Edgar Hoover's half-sister, who was 31 years old, had 5 children, and a husband. She was murdered. And his father, my Uncle Ivy, was 58 years old, and he was murdered because they decided that at that time in life, he should have owned up to who he was.
Millie's family believes J. Edgar was responsible for the murder of his biological father, Ivy, and his half-sister, Mazzola. They both died under mysterious circumstances, and Millie's research team encountered issues locating their death certificates. When they were finally able to track them down, no cause of death was listed. For decades, as he worked for the FBI, there was chatter concerning his genetic makeup. Hoover was well aware of the gossip circulating. Writer Gore Vidal, who grew up in D.C. in the 1930s, once stated in an interview, "It was always said in my family that Hoover was mulatto and that he came from a family that passed." Author Anthony Summers wrote in his book, Official and Confidential, in some communities in the East, it was generally believed that Hoover had black roots and was even referred to as a soul brother. Millie McGee made it her mission to shed light on a family secret that caused her years of anguish. The discovery of the truth reportedly freed her. The pain of the past that haunted her had now been released. Throughout Hoover's career, he targeted nonviolent leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Hampton for attempting to fight for the equality of Black Americans, even allegedly murdering some. He also created COINTELPRO to disrupt, misdirect, and discredit all Black liberation movements. He even publicly denounced interracial marriage. Additionally, he targeted members of the gay community who could be arrested on a morals charge, despite there being continuous rumors that he had a long-term relationship with Clyde Tolson, who he left most of his estate to after his passing. The Mafia, specifically Meyer Lansky, reportedly blackmailed him with compromising photos of he and Tolson. This is why he reportedly denied the existence of organized crime for decades. After dying from high blood pressure, his obituary mentioned nothing of his family, only his personal accomplishments. Never be ashamed of who you are, for it can lead to a life of destruction, hate of yourself and hate of others. Race is a silly concept, a lie sold through racist propaganda and pseudoscience to justify slavery. People who hate another group simply because their skin color is the darker hue are operating on a low, dark vibration. Remember, we are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this video. If you're interested in learning Black history facts hidden from American schools, go to the link in the description to purchase my ebook. It's written on a 7th grade reading level for children and adults. And also support my Patreon for exclusive mini documentaries like this.